If you're a Christian woman over 50 who wakes at 3:47 a.m. with your chest so tight you can't tell if it's grief or a heart attack, this story will change everything. Margaret Ann Robertson was 59 when widowhood crushed her ability to breathe, pray, or believe God still saw her. MIT research confirms that women's spiritual clarity actually peaks at 57. Yet here was Margaret, 2 years past that peak, unable to form a single prayer. What she discovered wasn't just healing, it was a divine rhythm called soul flowing that transformed her suffocating 3:47 a.m. panic into a 5 a.m. resurrection. And it started the morning everything changed. The Tuesday after Easter, Margaret woke at 3:47 a.m. for the 731st consecutive morning since David's heart stopped. She knew the exact count because she'd been marking them in his Bible, tiny pencil marks that looked like prison tallies. The bedroom smelled wrong without his Old Spice and coffee breath. Even the darkness felt heavier on her side of the bed, as if grief had physical weight that pressed her deeper into the mattress. Something had to change, but Christian women over 50 don't just reinvent themselves, do they? Her feet found the cold floor, muscle memory carrying her to the bathroom, where the mirror waited with its daily cruelty. The woman staring back had her mother's jowls and her grandmother's defeated eyes. This wasn't the face David kissed goodbye that last morning, the one that still believed in tomorrow. The house groaned in the pre-dawn silence, each sound a reminder that homes need 2 heartbeats to feel alive. Margaret pressed her hand to her chest, checking if hers still counted. The chest pain started then, not sharp like David described his, but crushing like invisible hands, squeezing her ribs together. Dr. Morrison had warned her, "Your stress levels are dangerous, Margaret. 90 days to make changes, or you're following David's path." She'd nodded politely, the way mature women of faith do when receiving impossible news. But how do you distress when stress is all that's keeping you upright? She shuffled to David's study, now her prayer room, though prayer was generous for what happened there. His leather chair still held his shape, that permanent indent from 32 years of morning devotions. Margaret lowered herself into it, feeling like a child wearing her father's shoes. The Bible fell open to Psalm 34, David's favorite, but the words blurred through tears she didn't remember starting. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted," she whispered to the empty room. But if he was close, why did heaven feel like another continent? The clock clicked to 4:15 a.m. Another failed morning. Another day of pretending she wasn't drowning in broad daylight. But that's when she noticed something written in David's margin she'd never seen before. "Soul flowing, the secret Maggie needs when I'm gone." Silence has teeth when you're alone at 59. It doesn't just surround you, it devours. Starting with the small sounds you never noticed when someone else breathed in your space. Margaret discovered this violence at 3:47 a.m., when even her heartbeat seemed too loud for the empty house. The refrigerator's hum became screaming. The clock's tick turned into gunshots. This wasn't peace. This was audio torture designed for widows overcoming burnout as Christians pretend everything's fine. David's last letter sat on the nightstand, 3 pages of shaky handwriting from the cardiac unit. She'd memorized every word, but tonight, she needed his voice, even if only through ink. "My darling Maggie," it began. "By the time you read this, the silence will feel violent. I know, because I imagined life without you every night, for 32 years. And the thought alone made me hold you tighter." Her fingers traced his words, feeling for the pressure of his pen, some physical connection to his hand. "There's something I never told you," the second page revealed. "Remember when your mother died and you couldn't pray for 6 months? You discovered something then, a way of flowing with God instead of forcing it. You called it your soul rhythm, but I wrote it down differently in my journals. I called it soul flowing, because that's what I watched you do. You stopped grinding against grief and started flowing with grace." Margaret set the letter down, her chest tightening with fresh pain. She'd forgotten that season after Mother's death, how prayer became impossible until she stopped trying so hard. But that was 20 years ago, when 39 felt ancient. Now at 59, she'd lost the rhythm entirely. The grinding had returned, but without the strength to push through it. The house phone rang 3:52 a.m. Margaret's heart lurched. "Mom." Sarah's voice, tight with panic. "Mom, I had the worst dream about you. Are you okay? Please tell me you're okay. But how do you tell your daughter that okay is a foreign language now? That you're fluent only in the dialect of surviving until sunrise? Loneliness at 59 doesn't knock, it moves in, rearranges your furniture, and claims David's side of everything. Margaret felt it physically, a weight on her sternum that made breathing feel like bench pressing her own grief. The doctor called it stress-induced chest pain, but Margaret knew better. This was her heart literally breaking, 3:47 a.m. at a time. Spiritual growth after 50 wasn't supposed to feel like dying, yet here she was, sprouting thorns instead of flowers. The voice of wasted years started its morning sermon. You're done, Margaret, 59 and falling apart. David got the better deal, quick exit, no suffering. You get the slow fade, watching yourself disappear one day at a time. She recognized this voice. It had visited after Mother died, after the miscarriage, after David's diagnosis. But now it had moved in permanently, broadcasting from the empty spaces David used to fill. She dragged herself to the kitchen, muscle memory making coffee for two before remembering. The extra cup sat there, accusing. Sarah kept suggesting therapy, medication, professional help for your complicated grief, as if grief came in simple and complicated versions, like tax forms. As if there was a pill for husbands. Ghost lives in everything I touch. The congregation at First Baptist had tried initially, casseroles and sympathy for 6 weeks, then subtle distances when her grief didn't follow the acceptable timeline. It's been 2 years. Margaret, Helen Summers mentioned last Sunday. Maybe it's time to consider dating again. Dating at 59. With David's cologne still in the medicine cabinet, and his voice on the answering machine she couldn't bear to change. But loneliness wasn't just David's absence, it was God's silence. 37 years of faith, and suddenly the ceiling was brass. Prayers bounced back, unopened. Scripture felt like reading a foreign language she'd forgotten. Even worship music made her angry. All those promises about joy coming in the morning. What if morning never comes? What if 3:47 a.m. is all that's left? That's when she remembered Ruth, the church janitor who'd whispered something strange at David's funeral. When you're ready to stop drowning, find me. I know about soul flowing. Every corner of the house held a David-shaped memory that ambushed Margaret at vulnerable moments. The kitchen backsplash he'd installed wrong but refused to fix character. Maggie, it's got character. The bedroom door that creaked at exactly the spot where he'd paused to watch her sleep. The garage that still smelled like motor oil and certainty. At 59, finding purpose after 50 felt impossible when your entire world was a museum of what used to be. Sarah arrived unannounced at 7 a.m., using her key like an intervention. Mom, we need to talk. The dreaded daughter words that meant she'd been researching again. File folders emerged from her designer bag. Grief counselors, support groups, a brochure for something called complicated grief disorder. Sarah, the successful lawyer, needed to fix this like a case she could win. You're not getting better, Mom. It's been 2 years. Some things don't get better, Margaret heard herself say, surprising them both with her hardness. Some things you just learn to carry. But even as she said it, she knew the weight was crushing her. 90 pounds lost since David died. Hair falling out in the shower. Hands that shook when she tried to hold her coffee cup. This wasn't carrying. This was being buried alive in slow motion. Mom, you wake at 3:47 every morning. I know because you call me at 3:52, even when you don't realize it. Your phone shows 17 missed calls to my number at that exact time this month. Sarah's evidence, laid out like a prosecutor. This isn't normal grieving. This is something else. You need help that prayer can't provide. Margaret wanted to tell her daughter about David's note, about soul flowing, about Ruth's strange promise. But how do you explain that God might be hiding a secret in your 3:47 a.m. hell? How do you convince your rational daughter that maybe, just maybe, the breaking is the breakthrough? Give me 30 more days, Margaret negotiated, surprising herself. 30 days to try something different. If nothing changes, I'll go to your therapist. The words wouldn't come anymore. Margaret sat in David's chair at 3:47 a.m., Bible open, mouth open, but prayer had become a foreign language she'd forgotten how to speak. 40 years of faith, and suddenly she was spiritually mute. The voice of wasted years whispered its diagnosis. God's done listening to you. You used up all your prayers on David's healing, and look how that turned out. Biblical rest for women felt like a cruel joke when rest required faith, and faith required believing someone was listening. Dear God, she tried again, but the words fell flat before reaching the ceiling. How do you talk to someone who let your husband die mid-sentence? David's last words weren't profound. He was complaining about the hospital jello when his heart stopped. No goodbye. No final I love you. Just silence where his voice should be. And now that same silence from heaven. The controversial truth nobody tells you. Sometimes faithful Christians lose their faith. Not in a dramatic rebellion, but in a quiet forgetting. Like losing your native language after too many years away from home. Margaret hadn't stopped believing in God. She'd stopped believing He believed in her. At 59, she'd become spiritually invisible. A ghost haunting her own faith. She picked up David's journal, the one marked private thoughts, feeling like a trespasser, but desperate for his voice. Page after page of prayers for her, not for his healing, but for her future. Lord, when I'm gone, remind Maggie about soul flowing. She discovered it once, she'll need it again. Break her the right way, so she can heal the right way. Break her the right way. What kind of prayer was that from a dying husband? But then, there it was, David's detailed description. Soul flowing isn't forcing prayer when words won't come. It's letting your very breathing become prayer. It's finding God in the rhythm of your heartbeat, the rise and fall of your chest. Maggie did this after her mother died, stopped trying to pray perfectly, and started flowing with imperfect faith. 3:47 a.m. isn't her curse. It's her invitation to remember. Ruth appeared in the church parking lot at 3:47 p.m., exactly 12 hours after Margaret's morning terror. The 73-year-old janitor moved like water, all grace despite her arthritis. You ready now? She asked without preamble. Ready to learn what David knew about soul flowing? She held a worn notebook, its pages yellowed with age, and what looked like tears. David talked to you. Margaret's voice cracked. Ruth had cleaned their church for 20 years, but Margaret realized she'd never really seen her, just another invisible woman over 50, serving quietly in the shadows. He did more than talk, child, he learned. Every Tuesday at dawn for his last year, we practiced soul flowing together. He was preparing something for you, through me. Ruth opened the notebook, revealing David's handwriting mixed with her own. Soul flowing isn't a technique you master. It's a rhythm you remember. Your body knows it too. Did it birthing babies? You do it in deep sleep. It's the prayer that happens when you stop praying and start being. Watch. Ruth placed her hand on her chest, breathing so slowly Margaret could barely see movement. 5 counts in. Hold for 7. 8 counts out, Ruth demonstrated. But that's just the body part. The soul part is this. Instead of forcing words to God, you let God's words flow through you. Scripture becomes breath. Breath becomes prayer. Prayer becomes presence. David said you discovered this 20 years ago, but forgot. Trauma does that, makes us forget our own wisdom. Margaret tried to mirror Ruth's breathing, but panic rose instead. I can't, it hurts to breathe deeply. My chest. Ruth's weathered hand covered Margaret's. That's not grief, child. That's resistance. You're holding your breath against the pain, but the pain needs to flow through, not around. Like birthing, you can't hold back labor. Soul flowing is spiritual labor, birthing the new you. The words hit different at 3:47 a.m. when you're broken enough to receive them. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Margaret had read Psalm 34-18 1,000 times, but tonight, with Ruth's breathing technique still fresh, the words became physical. She felt them enter her lungs, spread through her bloodstream, reach the shattered places. This wasn't reading scripture. This was scripture reading her, beginning her morning routine with God in a completely new way. David marked this verse the night before he died. Ruth had revealed, he said when you found it again, you'd understand that being crushed isn't the opposite of being saved. It's the prerequisite. God can't get close to an intact heart. It needs cracks for the light to enter. Margaret traced David's highlighting. seeing where his pen had pressed harder, leaving indentations like braille for her fingers to read. She tried Ruth's technique again, breathing in "The Lord is close, holding to the broken-hearted, exhaling and saves those who are crushed." The words synchronized with her heartbeat, creating a rhythm she recognized from somewhere ancient in her bones. This was what she'd done after Mother died, before she had words for it. Soul flowing, letting scripture breathe through you when you can't breathe on your own. The chest pain shifted, still there, but different. Instead of crushing, it felt like opening, like her ribs were making space for something new. The voice of wasted years started its usual sermon. But for the first time in 2 years, it sounded distant, muffled by the rhythm of divine breathing. Margaret wasn't praying. She was being prayed through. The difference was everything. By 5 a.m., Margaret had moved through 5 psalms, not reading but breathing them. Her journal, unused for months, suddenly filled with words that weren't quite hers. The breaking is the making. The crushing is the opening. Soul flowing isn't doing. It's being done through. David knew. Ruth knows. Now I'm remembering. The sunrise looked different, not happy, not fixed, but possible. Thursday, 3:47 a.m. But this time, Margaret was ready. She'd prepared David's study like Ruth instructed. Single candle, worn Bible, glass of water, and the notebook where David had mapped out her soul-flowing journey. The chest pain started its morning assault, but instead of fighting it, she breathed into it. 5 counts in. Be still and know. 7 counts hold. Silence. 8 counts out. That I am God. Her 5 a.m. prayer routine was becoming less performance, more presence. The first breath hurt like always. The second, slightly less. By the 10th breath, something shifted, not healing exactly, but harmony. The pain was still there, but she was flowing with it instead of against it. Like Ruth said, you can't outmuscle grief, but you can outflow it. Margaret felt her ribs expand fully for the first time in 2 years, her lungs remembering their capacity. This is what drowning in reverse feels like, she wrote in the margin of David's Bible. Not gasping for air, but finally letting it in. All this time I was suffocating on my own held breath, thinking that was strength. The voice of wasted years tried to interrupt. But the breathing rhythm was stronger now, like a tide that couldn't be argued with. She moved to the second phase Ruth taught her. Embodied prayer. Standing arms slightly raised, swaying like wheat in wind. Let your body pray what your words can't, Ruth had said. David did this every morning his last month. Said he was practicing for heaven's rhythm. Margaret felt ridiculous at first. 59-year-old woman dancing alone in the dark. But then her body remembered something older than embarrassment. By 5 a.m. she'd moved through the entire sequence, breathing, swaying, then sitting in complete stillness, letting the silence be pregnant instead of empty. The sunrise caught her mid-breath, painting the room gold. For the first time since David died, morning felt like possibility instead of punishment. Sarah called at 5:47 a.m. Mom, you didn't call at 3:52. Are you okay? Margaret smiled, a real smile, not the performance one. I'm learning to breathe again. The practice evolved. Margaret discovered that 5 a.m. held different light than 3:47 a.m., not just physically, but spiritually. Where 3:47 was the dark night of the soul, 5 a.m. was the first hint of resurrection. She began what Ruth called scripture saturation, not Bible study, but scripture breathing, letting verses move through her like oxygen. This wasn't faith-based productivity. This was faith-based being. Start with one verse. Ruth had instructed, not to memorize or analyze, but to become. Let it repeat in your breath until you can't tell where the verse ends and you begin. Margaret chose Isaiah 43:2. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. In, out, in, out. The words matching her heartbeat until they became her heartbeat. David's journal revealed he'd done this too. Maggie will need Isaiah 43 when she's drowning. She'll need to know the waters won't overflow her, even when she's sure they will. Soul flowing through scripture, that's her lifeline. How did he know? How did this man who complained about hospital jello prepare such a detailed map through her grief? The voice of wasted years grew quieter each morning, drowned out by the rhythm of ancient words made present. Margaret wasn't studying scripture anymore. She was swimming in it, letting it hold her weight when her own strength failed. Even Brené Brown had written something similar. Sometimes the only way through is to let something bigger than your pain carry you. By day 7 of this practice, Margaret noticed her handwriting changing. The shaky grief-struck letters were steadying. Her appetite returned, not fully, but enough to make actual breakfast instead of just coffee. Sarah noticed immediately. "Mom, you look different. Not better exactly, but more here, more present." Margaret wanted to explain about soul flowing, about 5 a.m. redemption, but some things can't be explained, only experienced. Jennifer found Margaret online at 3:47 a.m. in the Widows Walking Through Facebook group. Her message was simple. "I see you're on at this ungodly hour too." 3:47. Two strangers, both Christian women over 50, connected by insomnia and loss. Jennifer's husband, Paul, had died 3 years ago. "I discovered something called soul flowing," she typed. "It saved me." "You know, Ruth," Margaret typed back, hands shaking with excitement. "No, but I know the practice. There's more of us than you think. Women who wake at 3:47, who've found the flowing instead of the fighting. We have a small group, very quiet, very private. No toxic positivity, no rushed healing, just breathing through the breaking." They video called 2 strangers who looked like sisters in grief. Jennifer's eyes held the same shadows, but also something else's steadiness Margaret recognized from Ruth. "The medical explanation is interesting," Jennifer shared. 3:47 a.m. is when cortisol naturally spikes for menopausal women. Add grief, and it becomes a perfect storm. But what if that storm is actually a door? "Sarah thinks I need therapy," Margaret confessed. Jennifer laughed, not cruel, but knowing. "My daughter insisted on antidepressants. I took them for a while. They numbed the pain but also numbed everything else." Soul flowing doesn't numb, it flows. There's a difference between not feeling and feeling at all but not drowning. They agreed to meet online each morning at 5 a.m. after their individual soul flowing practice. Not to talk, necessarily, but to witness each other's survival. Sometimes just knowing another woman is breathing through the same darkness changes everything. Jennifer said, "We're not meant to resurrection alone." Day 12 of soul flowing. And Margaret woke at 3:47 a.m. to David's voice, not peaceful this time, but the sound of his heart stopping, that gasping gulp he'd made in the hospital. The grief returned with violence, like it had been waiting for her to let her guard down. This is the truth about overcoming burnout as a Christian. Healing isn't linear, and setbacks feel like betrayal. The voice of wasted years returned full volume. "See, told you this soul-flowing nonsense was just another false hope. You're still broken, still alone, still dying slowly at 59. David's gone, and breathing exercises won't bring him back." Margaret's chest seized, the pain sharper than ever. Had the past 12 days been delusion? She tried Ruth's breathing technique, but panic overrode rhythm. Tried standing for embodied prayer, but her legs shook too hard. Even scripture felt empty words on a page, nothing more. This was worse than before, because now she'd tasted hope and lost it. The grief felt personal now, like it was punishing her for trying to escape. Jennifer texted at 4:15 a.m., "Setback morning. They happen. Day 10 to 14 are always brutal. Your body realizes you're actually changing and panics. Don't quit now." This is the grief making its last stand. But it didn't feel like a last stand. It felt like complete defeat. Margaret couldn't even cry properly, just dry heaves of sorrow that produced nothing but more pain. Ruth arrived at 7 a.m., unannounced, holding tea that smelled like earth and promises. "David warned me about day 12, said you'd hit this wall. It's in his journal, look." She opened to a page Margaret hadn't seen. "Maggie will think she's failing around day 12. She's not. She's composting. The old has to fully die for the new to grow. Don't let her quit when she's this close to breakthrough." The revelation came at 3:47 a.m. on day 14. The pain wasn't the enemy. Margaret had been trying to use soul flowing to escape grief, but Ruth corrected her understanding. "It's not about flowing around pain, child. It's about flowing through it. Like a river doesn't avoid rocks. It shapes them, incorporates them, makes them part of its song. This wasn't spiritual productivity in the American sense, doing more, faster, better. This was spiritual presence, being with what is. Margaret tried a different approach. Instead of breathing to calm the chest pain, she breathed to acknowledge it. Hello, grief. You're here at 3:47 like always. Let's breathe together. The shift was subtle but revolutionary. She wasn't fighting anymore, wasn't fixing. She was flowing with the reality of widowhood at 59, not trying to positive think her way past it. Dr. Morrison had said something that finally made sense. Your body is keeping the score of every held breath since David died. The chest pain might actually be 2 years of suppressed screaming. So Margaret screamed into pillows at first, then freely in David's study. Not pretty spiritual screaming, but raw animal sounds that had been trapped in her ribs. Soul flowing included this too, apparently. The ugly parts, the unchristian noises. Jennifer shared her own revelation during their 5 a.m. call. I spent a year trying to pray my way back to normal. Then I realized there is no normal after this. There's only forward, and forward looks nothing like backward. Soul flowing isn't about returning, it's about becoming. Margaret wrote this in David's Bible, margins, not healing to become who I was, but breaking to become who I meant to be. By sunset, Margaret had moved through 7 waves of grief, breathing through each instead of bracing against them. The voice of wasted years still whispered, but now she recognized it as grief's bodyguard, trying to protect her from hope that might hurt. Thank you for trying to protect me, she told it. But I'm strong enough to hurt and heal simultaneously now. There was something Margaret hadn't told anyone, not Sarah, not Ruth, not even Jennifer. The night David died, she'd been angry with him. They'd fought about selling the house, downsizing, practical things that seemed important, until they absolutely weren't. Her last words to him were, "Fine, David. Do whatever you want. You always do anyway." 4 hours later, he was dead, and those words became her permanent goodbye. Mature women of faith weren't supposed to carry such ugly last moments. The secret had been eating her alive, worse than grief itself. Soul flowing kept bringing it up, like breathing was dislodging more than just surface pain. At 3:47 a.m., she finally spoke it aloud in David's study. I was mad at you. My last words were mean, and I can't take them back. And you died thinking I was angry, and that's why I can't breathe them. Choking on words I can never unsay. The confession broke something open, not healing, but honesty. Margaret had been performing grief, showing people the widow they expected while hiding the complicated truth. Yes, she missed David desperately. But she was also angry at him for leaving, for not taking better care of himself, for dying mid-argument, for making her the villain in their final scene. She opened David's journal to a random page and nearly stopped breathing. His handwriting, dated the morning he died. Maggie's mad about the house. She's right, I am stubborn. But Lord, she doesn't know what I know. That I'm dying today. That our silly fight is actually perfect. Because it means she'll have anger to fuel her through the first phase of grief. Anger is easier than pure sorrow. Thank you for our last fight. It's my final gift to her, permission to be mad instead of just sad. Margaret sobbed, not pretty tears, but the ugly cry that mature women of faith aren't supposed to have. David had known somehow, he'd known, and he'd received her anger as a gift. The voice of wasted years went completely silent for the first time in 2 years. In its place, she heard David's real voice, not memory but presence. Flow, Maggie. Stop fighting the current and flow. Who am I if I'm not David's wife? Margaret asked Ruth during an unexpected afternoon visit. It was the question she'd been avoiding for 2 years. At 59, finding purpose after 50 was complicated enough, but finding purpose after losing your primary identity felt impossible. She'd been Mrs. David Robertson for 32 years. Now she was just Margaret, and Margaret felt like a stranger. Ruth's answer surprised her. You're asking the wrong question, child. It's not who am I without David. It's who am I with God, now that David's not in the way. The words stung with their truth. David had been wonderful, but he'd also been large, his personality, his faith, his presence filling every room. Margaret had been content to be his supporting actress. But now she was thrust into a leading role she'd never auditioned for. Sarah called with perfect timing, her voice tight with her own crisis. "Mom, Tom asked for a divorce. Says I'm married to my job, not him. How did you and Dad make it work for so long?" The role reversal was jarring Sarah, needing Margaret's wisdom instead of trying to fix her. "We didn't make it work," Margaret heard herself say. "We let it flow." There's a difference. Something shifted in that conversation. Margaret wasn't just grieving widow anymore. She was keeper of 32 years of marriage wisdom that Sarah desperately needed. "Your father and I discovered something called soul flowing," she began, surprising herself by sharing the secret. "It's not about perfect partnership. It's about flowing with imperfection, breathing through the difficult seasons instead of holding your breath waiting for them to pass." By evening, Margaret had written 3 pages in a new journal, not David's, but her own. Ideas for helping other widows, a possible grief group called the 5 a.m. Sisters, ways to teach soul flowing to women suffocating on their own held breath. The voice of wasted years tried one last assault. "You're nobody without David." But Margaret's response was firm. "I'm somebody David prepared for this exact moment." David's birthday arrived like a scheduled catastrophe. October 15th, 3:47 a.m. He would have been 62. Margaret found herself in the garage, searching for his toolbox, needing to hold something that still smelled like his hands. Instead, she found the anniversary card he'd bought for her 3 days before dying, 33 years together, with a handwritten note inside. "Maggie, by the time you find this, I'll be home, but you still have work to do. Remember, biblical rest isn't stopping. It's flowing with God's rhythm instead of the world's." The card destroyed her carefully constructed soul-flowing practice. All the breathing techniques, all the scripture meditation, all the 5 a.m. victories crumbled at the sight of his handwriting, planning a future that wouldn't exist. The grief returned with compound interest, every suppressed sob demanding payment. Margaret couldn't breathe, couldn't flow, couldn't even stand. She literally crawled back to the house, the concrete scraping her knees through her nightgown. This wasn't the dignified suffering of mature women of faith. This was animal grief, the kind that embarrasses everyone, including the griever. The voice of wasted years didn't even need to speak. Margaret was doing its work. "I'm too broken for soul flowing. Some pain doesn't flow, it drowns." Sarah found her at 6 a.m., still on the laundry room floor, holding David's card like evidence of a crime. Mom, breathe. Please breathe." But breathing felt like betrayal. If she breathed, she'd survive this moment. And surviving felt wrong when David couldn't. "I found his anniversary card," was all Margaret could manage. Sarah read it, her lawyer composure finally cracking. They cried together, mother and daughter, no fixing, just flowing with the terrible truth that love outlasts the loved. Jennifer texted at 5 a.m. the next day. "Setback." Margaret responded with simple honesty. "Complete collapse. David's birthday broke me." Jennifer's reply was unexpected. "Good. You can't soul flow around the deepest wounds. You have to let them break you open first. Biblical rest includes the breaking. Now the real healing can begin. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you." Isaiah 43:2 had been Margaret's life verse for decades. But now, drowning in fresh grief from David's birthday card, the promise felt hollow. Where was God in these waters? She was definitely being swept over, pulled under, crushed by currents she couldn't fight. Faith-based productivity felt like a cosmic joke when faith itself was failing. Ruth arrived uninvited at 3:47 p.m. with a different translation. The Hebrew doesn't say "you won't be swept over." It says "you won't be swept away." There's a difference, child. David knew you'd need this distinction. Look. She opened his journal to a page marked for Maggie's drowning days. "My love will feel swept over. The waters will go over her head, but she won't be swept away. She's anchored to something deeper than grief." "How did he know?" Margaret whispered. Ruth's eyes held decades of wisdom, because he walked through his own waters, child. His fear of leaving you, his guilt about his heart condition, his terror that he hadn't loved you well enough. Soul Flowing taught him that drowning and surviving can happen simultaneously. You're not failing. You're in the deep end of healing. Margaret tried breathing Isaiah 43:2 differently, not as promise of ease but promise of presence. When I pass through, inhale, you are with me. Hold, I won't be swept away. Exhale. The water was still over her head, but something held her feet to solid ground. Not comfortable, not peaceful, but anchored. The voice of wasted years spluttered, waterlogged, "This isn't working." But Margaret could feel it was wrong. This was working. It just wasn't pretty. By day 3 of breathing through the drowning instead of against it, Margaret noticed something shifting. The grief hadn't lessened, but her capacity had increased. Like Ruth said, "You're not getting smaller pain. You're becoming a bigger container." She could hold David's birthday card now without collapsing. Could even see the beauty in his assumption of future. That's what love does. It plans for forever, even when forever is just 3 more days. Tuesday morning, 5:12 a.m. Margaret laughed. Actually laughed. Not the polite social version, but a real bubble of joy at a cardinal landing on David's workshop windowsill. The bird cocked its head at her through the glass, as if asking, "Remember joy? It's still here, waiting." For mature women planning their second act with God, joy feels like betrayal at first, as if happiness dishonors the grief. The laugh scared her. How dare she feel anything close to happiness? David was still dead. She was still alone at 59. The 3:47 a.m. wake-ups continued, but Ruth had warned her. Joy will return in drops before it returns in waves. Don't reject the drops, child. They're not betraying David's memory. They're honoring his wish for you to live, not just survive. She tested small joys carefully, like someone with a broken leg trying to walk. Coffee tasted good again. When had that happened? The morning light through David's study window made patterns she'd never noticed. Sarah's voice on the phone brought comfort instead of obligation. These weren't earthquakes of happiness, just tiny fissures where light leaked through. Jennifer shared her own joy timeline during their 5 a.m. call. Month 3, I smiled at a sunset. Month 6, I laughed at a TV show. Year 1, I danced in my kitchen. Year 3, I fell in love again, not with another man, but with being alive. Soul Flowing doesn't rush joy, but it doesn't forbid it either. The voice of wasted years made one last attempt. Happy widow equals heartless widow. If you're laughing, you didn't really love him. But Margaret knew better now. David's journal had an entire section titled, "Maggie's Joy After Me," with lists of things he hoped would make her smile again. Number 1. Cardinals at the workshop window. Asked God to send them as reminders that love transcends death. Night 27 of Soul Flowing. Margaret went to bed at 10 p.m. and woke at 5:47 a.m. Number 347 Terror. No chest-crushing panic. She'd actually slept for nearly 8 hours. The absence of insomnia felt wrong, like she'd abandoned her post. The voice of wasted years whispered, sleeping through 347 means forgetting David. But her body begged to differ. This was Christian self-care at its most basic, letting the body heal from 2 years of hypervigilance. She checked her phone, sure she'd missed the time. But there it was. 5:47 a.m. Jennifer had texted at 3:47, "You're not here. Good. Your body is learning to trust night." Again, Ruth had predicted this. Soul Flowing resets your circadian rhythm. Grief breaks it, breathing repairs it. David wrote that he prayed for your sleep to return as his final gift. The sleep changed everything. Without the 3:47 a.m. exhaustion, Margaret could think clearly for the first time in 2 years. Colors looked brighter, not metaphorically, but literally, as if exhaustion had dimmed the world. Her hands stopped shaking. Her appetite returned fully. Sarah noticed immediately. "Mom, you look 10 years younger. What happened?" "I slept," Margaret said simply. But it was more than sleep, was trust. Trusting her body to rest. Trusting God to hold the night watch. Trusting that David was okay with her healing. The controversial truth Joyce Meyer had written echoed in her mind. Sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is sleep. Rest is rebellion against the culture of constant crisis. For 3 nights, Margaret slept through 3:47 a.m. On the 4th night, she woke briefly, but without panic, just acknowledgement. Hello, 347. I see you, but you don't own me anymore. She used soul-flowing breathing for 5 minutes, then drifted back to sleep. The body was learning new patterns, riding over old trauma with new trust. Margaret caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror at dawn and didn't recognize herself, not because grief had aged her, but because healing had changed her. The woman staring back had David's favorite feature, her eyes, but they held something new: authority. Not the borrowed authority of being David's wife, but earned authority from walking through hell with soul flowing as her guide. Spiritual growth after 50 looked nothing like she'd expected. She was definitely thinner, grief's tax on the body, but also stronger. The 5 a.m. prayer practice had given her Ahm's definition from the embodied prayer movements. Her posture had changed. She no longer curved inward protecting her heart, but stood open, vulnerable, alive. Ruth called it the soul-flowing silhouette. What happens when you stop bracing against life and start flowing with it? Sarah visited for Sunday dinner and stopped mid-sentence. Mom, you single quotes different. Not just better, but actually different. Like you're becoming someone I haven't met yet. It was true. Margaret at 59 was becoming someone David hadn't met either, the woman he'd somehow seen in his journals. The one who would emerge from grief, not restored but transformed. She'd started writing, really writing, not just journal entries, but something bigger. The 5 a.m. Sisters, a soul-flowing guide for widows who wake at 3:47. Jennifer was helping edit, Ruth, providing theological insight. The book was writing itself, flowing from Margaret like water from a broken dam. The voice of wasted years had gone completely silent, replaced by what Margaret called the voice of what's possible. I'm not who I was, Margaret told her bathroom reflection. I'm not David's widow anymore. I'm Margaret who learned soul flowing, who survived 3:47 a.m., who discovered that breaking open isn't breaking down. I'm 59 and just beginning. The mirror reflected truth. This wasn't the face of someone who'd merely survived grief. This was someone grief had transformed into a teacher, a guide, a woman with a mission. Day 30 of soul flowing arrived like a graduation Margaret didn't know she'd been working toward. She woke naturally at 4:45 a.m. No alarm, no panic. Just gentle awareness that dawn was coming and she wanted to meet it prepared. The 3:47 a.m. wake-ups hadn't disappeared entirely, but they'd transformed from terrors into invitations. This is soul flowing, she whispered to David's picture. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of flow. Ruth arrived at 5 a.m. with a gift. David's complete journal, the one he'd entrusted to her. He said day 30 was when you'd be ready for the whole truth. Margaret opened it carefully, finding 5 years of entries, all about her. David had been documenting her strength long before she needed it, seeing her future self while she was still becoming. Maggie doesn't know she's a teacher. One entry read, she thinks she's just surviving, but watch her with grieving friends, she becomes water, flowing around their sharp edges until they smooth. When I'm gone, she'll teach thousands to flow. The 3:47 a.m. sisters will find her, and she'll show them that resurrection happens at 5 a.m., not instantly, but incrementally. The final entry, written in shaky handwriting from his hospital bed. Lord, I release Maggie to her second act. She thinks her story was being my wife, but that was just the preparation. Her real story begins when mine ends. Soul flowing will carry her from widow to warrior, from grieving to guiding. Thank you for letting me witness the beginning of who she's becoming. Margaret clutched the journal, understanding finally that David's death wasn't the end of their love story, but a chapter transition. He'd been preparing her for this exact moment, this exact mission. The 5 a.m. sisters weren't just her healing, they were her calling. The voice of wasted years was completely gone, replaced by what felt like David's blessing and God's commissioning combined. Margaret stood before 17 women in the church basement, all awakened by 3:47 a.m., all carrying grief like stones in their chest. I'm not here to tell you it gets easier, she began, her voice carrying new authority. I'm here to tell you about soul flowing, how to breathe when breathing hurts, how to flow when you feel frozen, how to find God in the exact spot where you lost everything else. These Christian women over 50 didn't need platitudes. They needed truth. 2 months ago, I couldn't breathe without pain. Couldn't pray without rage. Couldn't sleep without terror. My husband David died mid-sentence, leaving me at 59 to figure out who Margaret was without being Mrs. Robertson. The women leaned forward, recognizing their own story and hers. But he left me more than grief. He left me a map to something called soul flowing. She taught them Ruth's breathing technique. Watched 17 women place hands on their chests, feeling for heartbeats they'd forgotten they had. This isn't about moving on or getting over it, Margaret explained. This is about moving through, getting under the surface where the real healing happens. Your 3:47 a.m. wake-up isn't a curse. It's your soul's way of saying it's ready to flow again. Sarah sat in the back row, tears streaming as she watched her mother transform from widow to warrior. This wasn't the woman who'd collapsed on the laundry room floor. This was someone forged by grief into something unbreakable. My mom, Sarah would later tell Tom during their reconciliation, taught me that breaking apart and coming together can happen simultaneously. That's soul flowing. Margaret ended with David's final journal entry, reading it aloud for the first time. The 3:47 a.m. sisters will find each other. They'll discover that waking in darkness is actually preparation for greeting the light. Soul flowing isn't a technique, it's a recognition that you were always meant to flow, especially through the valleys. 17 women breathed together, their combined exhale sounding like the beginning of a movement. Dramatic function, New World emotional target, community keyword, 5 a.m. prayer routine 1 year later. Margaret's phone showed 4:47 a.m., but she'd been awake since 4:30, not from panic but from purpose. The 5 a.m. Sisters Soul Flowing Facebook group had grown to 10,000 members, all women who'd discovered that their darkest hour was actually their training ground. The morning routine with God that had saved Margaret was now saving others. Ruth, now 74, had become the group's spiritual grandmother, her daily posts reaching women across the globe. Good morning, 3:47 a.m. warriors. Ready to flow. The comments flooded in, women from Brazil, Kenya, Australia, all waking at the same desperate hour, all learning to breathe through instead of around their pain. Jennifer had started leading local chapters, teaching soul flowing in person to women who needed physical presence with their spiritual practice. We're not a grief group, she'd explain. We're a resurrection group. We practice rising, one breath at a time, one morning at a time, until rising becomes our nature. Sarah had become Margaret's unexpected co-author, helping write Soul Flowing, A Daughter's Perspective, as a companion to the main book. Their relationship had transformed from daughter trying to fix mother to two women flowing together through life's rapids. Tom had returned, drawn by Sarah's newfound ability to be present instead of perfect. Margaret stood in David's study now, the soul-flowing sanctuary, recording her daily message for the sisters. If you woke at 3:47 a.m., thinking you're alone, you're not. 10,000 of us woke with you. If you can't breathe through the pain, we'll breathe for you until you remember how. If you've forgotten how to flow, watch us wear rivers now, all flowing toward the same sunrise. This is soul flowing. This is what David saw. This is what you're becoming. Margaret's journey from that first 3:47 a.m. terror to standing before thousands of soul-flowing sisters took exactly 1 year. But the transformation wasn't linear, it was a spiral, circling through the same pain at deeper levels each time, integrating more truth with each rotation. The medical evidence was undeniable. Her chest pains disappeared completely by day 45. Blood pressure normalized by day 60. Dr. Morrison, stunned at her 3-month checkup, said, "Whatever you're doing, it's working better than any medication I could prescribe." Margaret simply replied, "I learned to breathe with God's rhythm, instead of against it." The voice of wasted years, that internal saboteur that had tormented her for 2 years, didn't just quiet, it transformed. Margaret realized it had always been grief's bodyguard, trying to protect her from hope that might hurt. Once she stopped fighting it, and started flowing with it, it became her ally, warning her when she was pushing too hard, reminding her to breathe. The 5 a.m. Sisters movement spread beyond widows. Divorced women, empty nesters, women facing retirement, illness, or identity crisis all found themselves in the soul-flowing practice. Churches began hosting 5 a.m. prayer sessions. Christian women over 50, who'd felt invisible, suddenly discovered they were lighthouses for others lost in similar storms. Ruth's influence expanded as she trained soul-flowing facilitators, always beginning with her signature wisdom. You can't teach what you haven't breathed through yourself. This isn't curriculum. It's embodied wisdom. David knew. Margaret learned. Now you know too. 3 research universities began studying the soul-flowing phenomenon, particularly the 3:47 a.m. synchronicity among grieving women. The preliminary findings suggested that cortisol spikes, combined with spiritual practice at that exact time, created unique neuroplasticity, literally rewiring the brain's response to trauma. My mother didn't just survive Dad's death, she was resurrected through it, Sarah shared at the 1-year memorial of the first 5 a.m. Sisters gathering. I watched her transform from someone drowning in grief to someone teaching others to swim. Soul flowing gave her back to not as she was, but as she was meant to be. Sarah's own practice had healed her marriage. Tom and I were grinding against each other, both trying to win. Mom taught us to flow with each other's imperfections instead. We breathe through conflicts now, instead of holding our breath until they pass. That's soul flowing in marriage, respecting the rhythm over forcing resolution. The reconciliation wasn't perfect. Soul flowing never promises perfect. But it was real, sustainable, breathing. Sarah had even started waking at 5 a.m. herself, not from trauma, but from choice, joining her mother in the practice that had saved them both. Margaret issued a challenge to every new 5 a.m. sister. Give me 90 days. Not to fix your grief or solve your problems, but to learn your soul's rhythm. Wake when you wake. 3:47, 4 a.m., whenever your body insists, but instead of fighting it, flow with it.